Okay, well, welcome everybody. Come on in, grab a seat. In this session, we'll be talking about consuming GraphQL APIs in C#. Thanks so much for joining me today. My name is Brandon Minnick, and GraphQL is a very, very special favorite topic of mine, and I'm so glad you're all here with me because I was in a similar seat as you just a couple years ago. I was at a conference just like this where I sat in the session about GraphQL and immediately fell in love with it. I learned about it and found out that this is exactly what I needed because I'm a mobile app developer. I make iOS and Android apps in C# using Xamarin and now .NET MAUI. And as a mobile app developer, one of our goals is to make sure that we don't use too much of your cellular data, that we don't use too much of your CPU and burn through your battery, because, well, that's a really good way to get a one-star review from one of your users. And so when I first learned about GraphQL and found out that that's exactly what it's made for, it's literally made so that we can make less round trips back and forth from the client to the server, so that we don't have to pull down data from the server that we don't need and just throw it away. Because with GraphQL, we can do everything in one round trip. With GraphQL, we get exactly the data we ask for, no more, no less. And so on the client side, I love it because it makes my apps faster. It makes my users happier. Hopefully, that's what gives me more 5-star reviews. And then even on the server side, if you're sending data that the client doesn't need, well, now you're also wasting bandwidth, spending more money on your cloud services. So GraphQL actually benefits both sides. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So before we get rolling, I want to point out a couple links. You'll see these at the bottom of just about every slide today. Here on the bottom left, that is my Twitter handle. You can find me at @TheCodeTraveler. And if you have any questions, if we don't get a chance to chat later in the conference, feel free to reach out to me. I'd love talking C#, .NET, GraphQL. If you want to chat about Xamarin, MAUI, iOS, Android, that's what I'm there for. Feel free to reach out anytime. And then here on the bottom right, this is a web page that I put together just for us today, just for this session. And this is where you can find all the resources. So don't worry about memorizing anything. Don't worry about having to take pictures and remember slides later, because as long as you grab this link, that's where you can find the slides. That's where you can find the open source sample app that we're going to play around with today. The completed version is already posted on GitHub. And I've also included a bunch of links to learn more about GraphQL if you want to continue on in this journey, which I hope we all do. So what is GraphQL? Well, quite simply, it's a query language for your API. So the way GraphQL works is the client tells the server exactly what we want, and then the server gives us that exactly back. Whereas with REST, it's kind of the opposite, right? With REST, we build a server, and we say, this is what the REST endpoint is going to give back to you. So it doesn't matter if you want 5 objects, we're still going to give you all 10 of them. And then on our side, as client developers, we just end up throwing those away, which is a shame. So GraphQL kind of takes that REST paradigm and turns it on its head and says, why don't we let the client tell us what they want, and then we'll just give them that data. But to really understand GraphQL, I think it's important to know where it came from. And GraphQL was actually invented back in 2012 by Facebook. And if you remember 2012, and if you had a Facebook account, you probably downloaded the Facebook app. This was right around the time they released their first native app. And when it first came out, it was really bad. They got tons and tons of 1- and 2-star reviews because users were complaining that the app was using too much of their cellular data, that the app would get really hot when they used it because it was really churning through the processor, it was using too much memory. And when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because if we look here, this is just a screenshot from my Facebook app, but look at all the data that this app loads just when you launch it. Like, I didn't do anything. I just opened the app, and all of a sudden, I'm greeted with all this multimedia, with videos, with images. I have a whole timeline for status updates from my friends and their profile pictures, their names, the date and time they posted it. And it's not just your timeline that loads. The Notifications tab also loads, so you get in all your notification data about upcoming events, mutual friends, people you may know, and their profile pictures, and our mutual friends count. And so if you think about this in terms of retrieving data from a REST API, it ends up looking something like this, where when the app first launches, it already knows who I am, so it can call facebook.com/user/ID and get the information about me. So it can get my updated profile picture. Maybe I updated my likes and dislikes on my profile, whatever. It'll grab all that. And then once it has that information, it's going to make a couple more API requests. Because once it knows about me and who I am and that confirms I'm authenticated, then it can go find my upcoming events. It can go find my friends' birthdays. It can go find mutual friends. But even once those responses come back, it's got to make another round trip to go get more information. Because for like mutual friends, OK, now it knows the IDs of my mutual friends, but it's got to do another round trip to go get their profile picture, their name. And so what we end up seeing, or what Facebook ended up seeing back in the day, was this cascaded API calls, where we would start with one. When that comes back, it would trigger multiple more. When those would come back, they would trigger multiple more. And they were seeing dozens, upwards of hundreds of API requests being made as soon as the user launches the app. So it was pretty easy to figure out why those bad reviews were flowing in, because sure, they're using a lot of data. All these round trips, they're waiting on the previous one. So data can only travel so fast, literally limited by the speed of light and the location of where you are and where the server is. So if the server happened to be on the other side of the world and it takes 600 milliseconds to get there and back, well, we got to wait 600 milliseconds before we can make that next API request, and then wait another 600 milliseconds before the next API request. And so you can really start to see how the load times could be slow, the cellular data usage can be high. And so the engineers at Facebook said there's got to be a better way. And that's when they came up with the idea for GraphQL, where they took all of those REST APIs and consolidated them down into one GraphQL API. Now, quick caveat, just in case anybody out there is a little uneasy that we're talking about GraphQL and we're talking about Facebook. Yes, Facebook invented it, but they no longer own it. Facebook has essentially donated the technology to the global good, to developers like us. There's a whole GraphQL Foundation that now exists. The GraphQL Foundation is what owns the GraphQL technologies. They have a steering committee with people from all over the world who are constantly updating and creating new GraphQL specs every year. So if you're not a fan of Facebook, that's OK. Yes, they invented it, but now it's safe and sound in the GraphQL Foundation, similar to how we have things like .NET foundations that handle open source libraries. The GraphQL Foundation also manages all of the open source GraphQL libraries. So right, they shrunk all those REST APIs down to this one API endpoint. And you might be thinking, well, wait a minute. If there's only one API endpoint, how does it know what data to give back? Because I'm sure Facebook has gigabytes of data just on me, let alone all of us. And we can't possibly send all that back in one request. Well, the way this works is when we hit this API endpoint as a client, as a mobile app, as a website, as a desktop app, what we do is we provide a query. So in our GraphQL query, we tell the server exactly what we want. So for example, in this query here, I'm telling the server I want to get information about a user. And so I've specified a specific user, and then I say, for that user, give me their name, their upcoming events count, and give me some friend suggestions, but actually just one, just the first one. And for that friend suggestion, give me that person's name and our mutual friends count. And then what comes back from the server is this JSON response. Now, this is the same JSON we know and love. So if you know how to deserialize JSON, you already know how to handle a response from a GraphQL server. It's the same thing. We would deserialize this using something like system.text.json. Now we can use it in our C# code. Happy days. And if we look at that JSON response, it's exactly the data we asked for. So there's the user, name Brandon Minnick, that's me. Looks like I had 4 upcoming events count. And it gave me 1 friend suggestion, just like I asked for it. It looked like it's recommending my friend Seth Juarez, and we have 18 friends in common. So this is really cool because, again, most of us probably already know how to handle this JSON response. But if we look at this query is not JSON. At first glance, it kind of looks like JSON, right? But if you squint a little bit, you'll notice there's no colons, there's no double dots, there's no quotes. And that's because this is the GraphQL. This is the query part of the query language. And so you might be thinking, well, oh, OK, great. Like, I came in here to learn about a new cool tool called GraphQL, and now this guy's telling me I got to learn a whole new language. Well, I'm out. But don't worry. It's actually super, super easy to figure out how to form these queries. I've been using GraphQL for years, and to be honest with you, I still have yet to memorize it. So let's show you how to do it using the GitHub GraphQL API. So let's jump out here, and I've gone to the GitHub GraphQL API, and when you navigate there, you're greeted with this GUI in our browser. And this is pretty cool. This is something called Graphical, which I think is a fantastic name because it's a graphical user interface for your GraphQL backend. So kudos to whoever came up with this name. And here is where we can figure out how to write queries for, in this case, GitHub's GraphQL API endpoint. Now, what's really cool with GUIs like these, you get stuff like this for free when you build your GraphQL server. So every tool, every SDK that's out there, at least as far as I know of, definitely in the .NET world, we all get this for free. So I build my GraphQL server, and it just comes included. And one of the coolest things about these is this docs tab here. So the way GraphQL works is when we create a GraphQL server, we define what's called a GraphQL schema. And that schema essentially it lists all the objects, it lists all the queries, the methods that any user can provide. And because we've predefined that, these tools, these GUIs like Graphical, when you load them, they can crawl the schema and provide you the current, latest, up-to-date documentation. And so this is really cool because it means GraphQL's self-documenting. We don't have to write any docs because all the latest, greatest docs are already here for us. Now, I think GitHub still does write some docs, and it's not a bad idea, right, to help your users out. But do you have to? Not really, because check this out. So here in the Documentation Explorer, we're greeted with 2 root types. These are the same root types that you'll see on every GraphQL server. The first one is query. Query is like a GET request. Query says, I want to get information back from the server, but I'm not going to change anything. So I'm just going to make a query. You're going to send me data. Happy days. A mutation does make changes on the server. So mutations kind of like our puts, our posts, our updates, our deletes, our patches, anytime we want to change something on the server, that's going to be a mutation. Now, for us today, this is actually live. I'm logged into GitHub. You have to log in to use this. So we're just going to stick to queries because I don't want to ruin anything on my GitHub account by accident. But the way this works now is on the left here, all I have to do is copy this value in. And then on the right, I can click this. So this is the object that comes back when I make a query. And when we drill down into it, now we can see all of the other objects that we can query for. And if you're familiar with GitHub, then a lot of this probably looks familiar. Like we can query for organizations. We could query for repositories. We can ask about security, all this fun stuff. So why don't let's do a query for this user here. And before I copy it, let's talk about this. Because again, this is telling us that when I query for a user, it's going to bring back a user object. But this one looks a little different. This says to query for a user, I need to provide a login, and that login needs to be a string. And now in the GraphQL world, this exclamation point means that string cannot be null. So I need to pass in a non-nullable string, which, if you think about it, makes sense, right? Because how do I query for a user if I don't tell you what user I want to query for? So again, I'm just going to copy this, paste this over here. And actually, you can already start to see, you actually get IntelliSense. Let's bring that back up. Oh, autocomplete and everything. There we go. So if we type in user, login, and I'll put in my GitHub username, which, again, kind of weird, right, that they use the word login. Like, it's not asking for your password. It's just asking for your GitHub username. But whatever, GitHub, you guys can do whatever you want. So now that we have that, we can drill deeper. So I can click on this user object again and start discovering what fields can I get back about a user. And so I see things here on the right, like I see bio, avatar URL. What else do we want to query for? Maybe we could search for company. We could do followers, see how many people are watching our GitHub accounts. And now we have a query. And I don't know if you noticed, but along with IntelliSense, it'll even tell you if you forget something. So see how we got a little red squiggle here? If I go to execute this right now, it's going to yell at me because it tried to warn me, but I didn't listen. So let's actually finish this query, run it, and there we go. This is the JSON response. And again, it's exactly the data that we asked for. So there's my bio, the URL for my avatar, the company I work at, the total followers I have. And if we decide later on that, in our app, the designer came along and said, we don't really care about things like the user's company anymore, well, we just remove that from our query, and now that company information's gone. So again, with GraphQL, we get all of this information in one round trip. We don't have to wait for this response to come back before then we can follow up like we have to do with REST to make another request for, say, the follower count. We get it all back at once, and we get exactly the data we need because it's exactly the data we asked for. So we don't have to worry about using too much bandwidth or paying extra in server costs because the server's always giving 10 objects when we only need 1. Now, this is pretty cool, right? But what are we really doing? We're not writing code here. We're in the browser. The browser's running on GitHub servers. Like, we're not even sending this query from here in Oslo on my computer. So I want to show you how this is actually working. And to do that, I'm going to bring up Postman here. And let's hide some of the details from test runs. So what I've done, I've entered in GitHub's GraphQL API endpoint here. And I've told Postman that I want to make a post request. Now, wait a minute. Post, isn't that a REST API thing? Well, it turns out every GraphQL request is just a post request. So if you've ever made a post request in C#, you already know how to make a GraphQL or a HTTP client request to a GraphQL endpoint. You just create your HTTP client, you say post async, and we get the data back. So pretty cool, but what do we put in the body here? So it's a post request, which means we're going to have something in our body. And it turns out we have one field that we enter in. That one field is query. And then for the value of that, we just come back here, copy this, and paste it in. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get rid of that white space, because otherwise Postman gets mad at me. There we go. Nope, one more. And I'm going to make sure we keep the quotes here. And there we are. So I put in the exact query that we just essentially copy-pasted in GraphQL. I just copy-paste that here. And when I click send, we get exactly the data back that we asked for. So under the hood, GraphQL is just using post requests. We can use C#, HTTP client, send post async, copy-paste those GraphQL queries into the body, and we're good to go. And just like we saw back in the browser, if if maybe I don't care about the avatar URL anymore, I just delete that from my query, and now it's gone. Pretty cool. OK, so let's do a quick review on GraphQL. GraphQL APIs have one endpoint. So every GraphQL request you make, whether you're going to do a query, a mutation, changing something on the server or not, you're going to hit the same endpoint. If you want to, you can have multiple GraphQL endpoints at your company. Some companies do that for, say, like a public-facing GraphQL API and an internal GraphQL API. That's totally cool. But you don't have to. Everything can go through the same endpoint. GraphQL APIs are self-documenting. So just like we saw in graphical, anytime we navigate to a GraphQL server in our browser, we're presented with this GUI that'll have all of the docs there. And those docs, as soon as we load that website in the browser, those docs are generated. So they're always up to date. They're always showing you exactly what's running on the server at that time. GraphQL requests are just post requests. So GraphQL leverages the post HTTP method under the hood. And again, if you know how to make a post request using HTTP client, then you already know how to make a GraphQL request as well. Just remember that the GraphQL request body is going to be one field for your JSON that's called query. And then on the other side, for the value, just copy paste in exactly what we found using the browser. And like we mentioned, that response is just JSON. So it's the same JSON we know and love. Deserialize it, and now we have C# to play around with in our code. All right. Well, speaking of code, let's actually write some. So there are two popular GraphQL client SDKs for .NET. The first one being GraphQL.client. This is kind of the OG. This was the first GraphQL client that was created for .NET developers. It's the oldest, and not surprisingly, it also has the most downloads on NuGet. But the one we're going to focus on today is Strawberry Shake. Strawberry Shake's newer. It's, we'll say relatively new. It's been around for about 2 years. And I'll tell you, I've used both of these. I have built apps that have used GraphQL client. I've built apps that use Strawberry Shake. And Strawberry Shake is incredible. The big difference between these two, well, I guess there's a couple big differences, but the main one that I really appreciate is Strawberry Shake writes the code for us. It includes a lot of source generators, a ton of source generators. And whereas with GraphQL client, I end up having to write all that code myself. So not that that's a bad thing. You know, GraphQL.client, the SDK is solid, it's stable, it's been around for forever. If you use it, great. But with Strawberry Shake, can't recommend it enough. We'll see all the code that it generates for us in just a second. But it's also the fastest client. They have benchmarks posted on the website. I've shared links to the website on the URL that I provided here, where they do benchmarks. And the creators of Strawberry Shake have literally created the fastest GraphQL client and the fastest GraphQL server SDKs in the world. So literally, it doesn't matter if you're coding in Python, Go, Rust. They go head-to-head against all of them and blow them all out of the water in terms of requests per second, memory allocation, speed and response. And it's kind of cool, because they're all Strawberry Shake's totally open source, so you can go see how they did it. And if you ever want to be terrified, go look at it, because it's nothing but pointers and refs and all the unsafe code that we're told not to do. But luckily, they're a lot smarter than me, so they know how to do it, and then they have a boatload of unit tests to make sure everything's good and everything's solid, which totally is. So let's check this out. I'm going to jump over here to Visual Studio, and I have an app that I built. And this app, let's bring it up. There we go. So made this in .NET MAUI, and right now, I've got an empty books page. So nothing appears on this page because, well, we're going to write that code together. But before we write the code for the client side, let me show you a little around the server side, because both of those are in here. So I have a HotChocolate GraphQL.mobile and HotChocolate.GraphQL.backend. And you might be wondering, well, wait a minute. HotChocolate, I thought we were talking about Strawberry Shake. Well, it's the same company. The company is called Chili Cream. Their backend SDK is called HotChocolate, and their front-end SDK is called Strawberry Shake. So I don't know. I guess they get really thirsty sometimes, and that's how they come up with their names. But yeah, we have strawberryshake.maui in our client side in our mobile app because, again, this is a .NET MAUI app. They also make strawberryshake.blazor if you want to use it for your Blazor app, or if you just want to use it in a console app. They also have just strawberryshake.core, which you can use. So lots of options there. But right, so on the server side, HotChocolate. So how does this work? Well, here's my program.cs file. That's it. How many lines of code is that? 11, including the using namespace up here. Literally, we just say builder.services.add GraphQL server. So this is an extension method that HotChocolate provides for us. And once you say that, it's going to basically do most of the work. And then all I had to do was provide it with a custom query type. So what does this look like? Well, this query, this is just a C# class. You'll notice it doesn't inherit from anything. It doesn't implement any interfaces. This is just something I wrote. And what this is 3 methods. One's called getBooks, which returns an IEnumerable of type book. We have another one called getBook, so one book, where if we provide the title, the GraphQL API will provide the first book it finds matching that title. Or we can search for the author using getAuthor. Same idea. We search via the author's name. We get the author's details back. And this is just a sample app, something I made so I could share it with you today. And so all this data is just hard-coded. But here in this query, this is where you would actually point to your data source. So these methods in the GraphQL world, these are called resolvers. And these resolvers point to wherever your data lives. So if your data is in a database, would go fetch the data from the database. Or what's really common nowadays, because most companies have already built a whole suite of REST APIs, is you can put a GraphQL server in front of those REST APIs, and then you can have these GraphQL resolvers point to your existing REST APIs. Because those REST APIs, they've been around forever. The company has, I'm sure, spent a lot of money and investment in them and don't want to lose them, because if you got rid of your REST APIs, it will probably break all your apps. But if you want to take advantage of GraphQL going forward, you can point these methods to those existing REST APIs and leverage all that existing technology you have that works and it's tested and trusted. And that's kind of been the really common approach for a lot of companies starting out. But yeah, if you're building a greenfield app, you can just point directly to your database. Happy days. So I have this running. So in my browser, I'm going to navigate to my local host here. So I'm just on localhost port 5100/GraphQL. And again, we get a cool little GUI here. So it looks a little different from Graphical, the one that is running on GitHub's GraphQL API. But if I'm being honest, this one's a little cooler because check out. Yeah. So again, this is made by the company Chili Cream, who makes HotChocolate for the server. They make Strawberry Shake for the client. And this is named Banana Cake Pop. So hope you're hungry. Try to keep up. But yeah, if we go look over here, right, we can see the schema reference. This is the one that I built, the one we were just looking at in code. And again, feels very similar to what we were just looking at on the GitHub API, where I have a query. And in that query, we can query for books, which returns all the books. And in GraphQL terminology, these square brackets denote a list. So anytime you see those square brackets around it, it means this is a list of type book. And again, that exclamation point means the list is not nullable, so we'll never return null. But also, the list will never contain a null book either. So a non-nullable book in a non-nullable list is what we're going to get back. And again, this was all auto-generated for me. I didn't do anything other than write this code right here. I promise. All I did was write this code, and then HotChocolate automatically inferred it for us. And they do some fancy things too. Like you can see, I named Let's see how we can get these side by side, maybe. Whoa, all right. So like I named this method getBooks, but when HotChocolate generated the API for me, they changed it to just books to kind of better follow best practices in GraphQL, which I appreciate. And again, if I had told it that the book was nullable, then as you can imagine, this exclamation point would go away, and it would auto-generate the API with the possibility of a null book coming back. But you can see that this is the one I made because I gave it a description called return all books, and we see down here, this returns all books. So it literally took this code just because I passed it in here and said, this is my query type, and then auto-generated all this stuff for us. So again, I've never memorized how to do GraphQL queries. I've never made one on the fly without coming here. So if we keep following that pattern, we can make a query. And we can use the IntelliSense here to say, I'm going to ask for all the books. And for each book, I want to know its title. I want to know its author. And give me that author's name and birthday. And when I click run, just like we expect, we get all of the books back from our API. Really, really cool. So how do we do this on the client side? Well, or how do we consume it on the client side is probably a better way of putting that. So let's actually dig into some code here. So as we've already pointed out, I added this NuGet package ahead of time, strawberryshake.maui. And again, if you're doing Blazor, they have strawberryshake.blazor. There's also strawberryshake.core if you just want the core functionality and you don't care about the platform. They got options for you. And when you add this to your app, there's a couple steps you have to do. And I'll show you those command line commands that I did ahead of time. But when you run this command line command to initialize Strawberry Shake, it generates this JSON file. And this JSON file has a couple things in it that are pretty cool. So first of all, I pointed Strawberry Shake to my GraphQL API endpoint. And so when I initialized Strawberry Shake, what it does, this is just a one-time thing, it goes out to your GraphQL API, and it pulls down the schema. So the same schema that I didn't write because I used HotChocolate to write my code in C#. HotChocolate generated that schema automatically for me. Strawberry Shake's pulling down that schema, and it saves it here locally. So if we scroll down, there's another file called schema.graphql, and this is the schema that HotChocolate on the server side had auto-generated for us. And you can see, like, this is exactly what we expect, right? Like, we have our book query, we have the books query that returns all the books, and that's the list of books with the exclamation points, meaning it's not nullable. We have the type of book, and every book is going to have a title, which is a string that's not null, and an author that's not null, and every author is going to have a name and a birthday. So right away, Strawberry Shake knows everything about our GraphQL API, and this is what it uses to auto-generate all the C# code. And if we dig in a little bit, I'm not sure how much everybody's played with source generators. If I'm being honest, they're pretty difficult to figure out. Once you get them working, though, they're really cool, really fun to play with. But check this out. So I went into the obj folder here for my mobile app. And if we dig into it, eventually we'll come across a folder called Berry. And that's where Strawberry Shake stores all its auto-generated code. So if we wanted to, I could open up this file, and we can see all of the code that it created for us. And this is tons of code. So things like a class called getBooksQueryResult. There's information in here for how it instantiates its version of HTTP client. And we're not going to go through this, but look at that. It generated almost 1,000 lines of code for us, whereas if we weren't using Strawberry Shake, we would have to write all this code ourselves. So again, this is why I love using Strawberry Shake. Highly, highly recommend it, because not only do we all get this code for free, but it's also the fastest SDK available to .NET developers and actually any GraphQL developers out there. So right, now we have our initialization file. I ran a command line command that I'll show you in a bit. To initialize it, it got the schema for us. So now it knows exactly how the type system and everything on our GraphQL server works. And what do we do next? Well, in .NET MAUI, it uses the same initialization paradigm that we use across .NET. So if you're a Blazor developer, ASP.NET Core developer, I'll guarantee you've seen the builder.services paradigm, where we have an iService collection that we can add transients, singletons, scoped variables to. Well, with Strawberry Shake, they gave me this method, add library GraphQL client. And that method is named that because I told it to. So back in that configuration file, you'll see I said, name this thing library GraphQL client. And then anytime you generate code, generate it in my namespace, HotChocolate GraphQL.mobile. So it went ahead and did just that. Thanks, Strawberry Shake. And then just like anytime we're adding HTTP client to our dependency injection container, we can configure it. So I gave it the base address, so it's just pointing here to localhost on my machine. And then we could configure the message handlers. I added some rules about error policies, so it'll automatically retry if it can't find the server. And then we won't go this deep into GraphQL today, but it also supports WebSockets. So another part of GraphQL, along with queries, which again, that's reading data from the server, mutations, which changes data on the server. GraphQL servers also have something called a subscription. And it's kind of exactly what it sounds like. It allows us to subscribe to events on the GraphQL server. So I can subscribe and say, hey, let me know anytime this repository changes, right? Let me know anytime a user commits code so that I can update in real time on my app. And we can subscribe to GraphQL servers. It uses iObservables, and we can just sit there and watch them, and all this real-time data just flows in, which is really, really cool. But for today, we'll just be sticking to the basics, stick to queries. So we've added our GraphQL client here to our services, or our iService collection. And so now I can go into my books view model, and I can start writing some code. Because I've already written this. I have this. This is the command that runs when the app launches, called refresh books. And right now, it's just totally empty. So that's why we don't have any data visible on our mobile app. But what I've done ahead of time is I've added in that library GraphQL client that Strawberry Shake generated automatically for us. And what we do, we can say var result equals client dot get books query dot execute async, and then I pass in my cancellation token. That's it. We've just gotten data back from our GraphQL server. It's automatically deserialized for us, and we can do whatever we want with it. So what do we write? Just a couple lines of C# code, including some initialization, and we're off and running. And so what we'd want to do is something like, just like we do with HTTP client, right? We want to make sure there's no errors. This will automatically throw a GraphQL exception, if I remember, something like that. It'll throw an exception if any errors are found. So if it couldn't connect to the server, it'll throw an exception. Or if you misform your GraphQL query, like if I ask for something that doesn't exist, well, this is going to yell at me, but you can see here, I still get an error back. So either I can't access it, or maybe I'm not allowed to access it based on permissions, whatever it might be, that'll rethrow any exceptions. But now that we know that the data doesn't have any exceptions, we can just double check that none of that data is null. And once we know it's not null, we'll just iterate over it. So we'll say for each book in result.data.books, add it to this observable collection that I've already initialized up here. So I'll just say books.add book, and there we go. And so now, when we run the app, let's see what happens. All right, so now we have all the data showing in our app, super fast. Granted, the round trip time is probably about a millisecond, but super, super easy, right? We just had to write a couple lines of C# code. We just had to add it to our iService collection, and Strawberry Shake basically did all of that for us. So now I want to show you, what if we want to make a different query, right? Like, we created this get books query by adding this file here. So this file is called getBooksQuery.GraphQL. And if we look back at the configuration for this GraphQL JSON file, it knows to search for any folder, any file in any folder with the .GraphQL file name and use that to create what we're asking it to. So whether it's a query, whether it's a mutation, look for these .GraphQL files and auto-generate the code for me. So why don't we create another one here on the fly? And let's do one called, how about we do get book by title. Now, what I'm going to do is, because if we're going to query for a book by a title, then we need to know what title we're querying for. And that means we need to pass in a variable. And the way that works here in GraphQL is to name the variable here. So I'll name it title, and I'll let GraphQL know that this is a non-nullable string. And then down here, we'll just use IntelliSense again to say I want a book. And then book needs to know the title, so I'll give it that variable title. And then, again, I want to know, give me the book's title, give me the book's author, give me the author's name, give me their birthday. And the only thing left to do is to pass in that variable. And we do that down here. You can actually see I'm getting yelled at. There's a little squiggle right down here where it says variables. And so for every variable that we add into our GraphQL query, we can easily add it down here. So I can say there's going to be a variable title, and hopefully I spelled that correctly. Let's see if this runs. Boom. And look at that. We get one book back from our GraphQL API. It's exactly the book we asked for, C# in depth. And now we've got another brand new GraphQL query that, just like we've been doing all day, right? Copy. And we're going to paste it in. What's it called? Get book by title. So get book by title.graphql. And I'm just going to paste that in. Again, I'm not memorizing anything about GraphQL or the server. And once I build this now, HotChocolate's off and running. So HotChocolate is now generating all the code behind this. When we first saw that auto-generated file, it was what, like 780 lines of code? So let's see, if we jump back in there. Go back to Barry, open this up. How are we doing now? Oh, look at that. Now we're up to 1,200 lines of code. 1,200 lines of code we didn't have to write. That's so cool. And if we go back to our view model, now we can use it. So I can say, let's see, this is the John Skeet result. He's the author of C# in depth. And just like we did above, I'll just say client. Now, check that out. I've got get book by title. Again, totally auto-generated for me. I didn't have to write anything other than copy and paste in a GraphQL query. And again, execute async. Now, remember we created that variable title? Well, guess what? Execute async says, hey, I need to know the title. So no problem. I'll pass in C# in depth again. And of course, give it our cancellation token like we always do as good developers. And you know what? We've already got that book displayed in the app, so I'll tell you what. Let's put a breakpoint here, run the app again, because we don't really need to add it to the screen twice. I love John Skeet, but we don't need to show his book twice in the library. But this breakpoint, boom, already done. And we can see the result here. So let's see. We dig into the result. There we go. We've got our data. And look at that. There's our book object. And our book, all right, C# in depth. And we can get information about the author here. And look at that. There's John Skeet. And I don't know his birthday, so I just basically made it January 1st. But yeah, so with, again, just not even writing any code, Strawberry Shake's generating this all for us. All I have to do now is just say execute async, pass in my variable name, and we're off and running. So couldn't recommend Strawberry Shake more. I actually have a couple apps in the App Store, and one of them I can't wait to implement Strawberry Shake in, because I didn't even use the other library. I didn't even use GraphQL.client in it. I actually wrote everything by hand. So I can't wait for the pull requests when I open that up, because it's going to remove thousands of lines of code, probably like 10,000 lines of code just gone. Code I don't have to maintain anymore. It's going to be great. OK, so we've got a little bit of time left. So let's see. I want to show you those initialization steps, because, yeah, I mean, I totally skipped them, but wasn't sure how much time we'd have. Wanted to make sure we saw all the cool stuff. But these are the docs. So they've got getting started docs for Blazor, Xamarin, console apps. He hasn't added MAUI yet. MAUI's still in preview. I've actually been working with this guy, Michael Stabe. You might see him around. He's given some talks. He's the really smart guy that writes all these source generators, that knows how to do all the pass-by reference and unsafe code. So if you ever want to meet a really, really smart guy, look out for Michael Stabe or go see his talks. He'll be around. And so what we do to initialize Strawberry Shake, we have to bring in its tool manifest. So we pop open the command line. We say .NET new tool manifest. And then we tell it to install the Strawberry Shake tools. And then once those tools are installed, I'm going to skip these steps, because these are just how to initialize the project, how to add the NuGet packages. Here we go. So this is the good stuff down here. So this, .NET GraphQL init, this is what auto-generated that GraphQL.json file. Whoops, zoom out. This one right here. So this file was auto-generated for me after I ran .NET GraphQL init. And when I do that, I point it to, I pointed it to my GraphQL server. So when I ran this, I said .NET GraphQL init, and then I pointed to localhost port 5100/GraphQL. And that's when it went out, and it fetched my GraphQL schema that, ironically, it also had generated for me on the server. And then again, this GraphQL schema is how Strawberry Shake knows how to auto-generate all the C# for us. So incredibly, incredibly powerful tool, and also just happens to be the most performant, most memory efficient, and the fastest on the market. So can't recommend it enough. Strawberry Shake. So let's do just a quick review, because again, I know I skipped over these steps. I want to really make sure we point this out. We do have to install the Strawberry Shake tools. So again, that means opening up the terminal, typing in .NET new tool manifest into your folder, so the folder where you have the project, then running .NET tool install strawberry shake.tools. And then we want to auto-initialize that schema, so telling Strawberry Shake, hey, go get my schema so that you can do all the work for me and generate all the C# code for me. And we do that by saying .NET GraphQL init, passing in the URL of our GraphQL API. And then after that, like we saw, we can add it to our iService collection if we're using dependency injection, which hopefully we are. I think at least that's my favorite way of doing everything. But really, after that, all we're doing is we're just adding these .GraphQL files. So you can put a .GraphQL file anywhere in your project, and Strawberry Shake will start searching your project every time you build. If it finds a new one, it'll generate all the C# code that goes with it. And then when we go back to our code, or when we go to write our code, all we do is say client dot whatever the query's name is .execute async, and we're done. Whew, all right. Well, if you haven't had a chance yet, here is the link to all of the resources today. So make sure to take out your phone, grab a picture of this. You can share it with your friends, share it with your colleagues who maybe couldn't make it today, because this is where you can find the slides. This is where you can find a link to the GitHub repo where we have the completed sample that we just built together today. And I've also included a lot of resources that I used when I was first learning about GraphQL that I know will be helpful for you too as well. Thank you.